Welcome to Buddhist for Sleep. Tonight, I invite you to explore a Zen story set in a mountain monastery, designed to accompany you as your body gradually relaxes and your mind releases the day's tensions. It's a circular tale, one that begins and ends in the same place, and offers a simple lesson about impermanence, attachment, and the value of silence. Listening to these kinds of stories before bed can help quiet repetitive thoughts, slow your breathing, and allow you to sleep more deeply. You don't need to remember every detail or follow the plot closely. Just let yourself be carried away by the imagery. Breathe slowly and allow sleep to come on its own, at its own pace. If these stories accompany you night after night, subscribe to the channel. Buddhist for Sleep, so you don't miss the next stories. The Bell of Silent Mountain. High atop a mist-shrouded mountain range, where pines grew twisted by the wind and clouds drifted so low they seemed to be part of the ground, stood a small temple called Silent Mountain. It was not a famous temple. It did not appear on the maps drawn by merchants or in the stories told by travelers in the inns of the valleys. It was, simply, a cluster of buildings made of wood darkened by the rain, with thick thatched roofs and a stone courtyard where a single ginkgo tree grew, so old that no one remembered who had planted it. In that temple lived a monk named Isin. He had arrived there as a child, given up by a family too poor to feed all their children, and had grown up amidst the slow rituals of monastic life, sweeping the courtyard before dawn, preparing tea, spending hours meditating in the main hall, and cultivating turnips and eggplants in the back garden. Over the years, Isin became entrusted with a single task, one that the previous master had given him before he died: to ring the great bronze bell that hung in a wooden tower at the edge of the cliff every morning, at the exact moment the first light touched the summit of the farthest mountain. No one in the temple knew exactly why the bell had to be rung at that precise moment, and not another. The previous master, a man named Ryokan, had said only this before closing his eyes for the last time: ring the bell when the light touches the mountain, and one day you will understand why. Isin had promised to follow that instruction, and for 20 years she had done so without fail, even in the harshest winters, when frost coated the bell rope and her hands grew numb with cold before she could finish the first ring. Every morning, Isin climbed the 108 stone steps that led to the tower. Every morning he counted the steps without meaning to, a habit his body had memorized before his mind. Every morning he waited in silence, gazing at the horizon, until the light grazed the distant summit, and then he pulled the thick rope and let the bronze sound fall upon the valley like a stone dropped into a still lake. The sound spread, weakened, and finally dissolved into the air, leaving behind a silence even deeper than the one that had existed before the tapping. For 20 years, Isin believed he understood the meaning of that task. He thought the sound of the bell marked the beginning of the day, that it ordered the time of the other monks, that it served as a useful signal for the peasants who worked in the fields below the mountain. He thought that his function, however humble, had a clear and sufficient purpose. But one autumn night, as the wind tore the last leaves from the ginkgo tree and scattered them across the stone courtyard, Isin heard something that would change the course of his life. It was very late. The other monks were asleep. Isin, unable to sleep, had gone for a walk in the courtyard, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the moon appear and disappear among the clouds that raced by the mountain wind. It was then, in that almost absolute silence, that he heard the sound of a bell. It wasn't his bell. The sound came from far away, from some lost spot among the western mountains. a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the echo of her own bell bouncing off the peaks. But Aisin, who knew the sound of her bell better than the sound of her own voice, knew at once that this peal was different. It had a deeper, longer timbre, as if it came from a much older bronze, cast in an era no one remembered. He waited, motionless, his heart beating faster than usual. The sound was not repeated that night, but the following night, at exactly the same time, he heard it again. And the next night, and the next. Each night that distant ringing came only once, brief and deep, and then the silence of the mountain swallowed him whole. Aisin asked the other monks if they had heard it too. None of them answered yes. The youngest monk, named Anrin, said he had only heard the wind in the pine trees. The oldest monk in the temple, who could barely walk without assistance, said that in his youth he had heard tales of a bell lost in the western mountains, a bell that, according to an ancient legend, had been cast by a master craftsman whose name no one remembered, and which had vanished centuries before during a war that ravaged the entire region. No one knew if the story was true, or if it was merely a fable the monks told each other on winter nights to pass the time. Aisin couldn't stop thinking about that sound. Every night, as he waited to hear it again, he felt a restlessness growing inside him, a restlessness he hadn't felt in 20 years of quiet monastic life. It wasn't a painful restlessness, but rather something akin to thirst, a simple and persistent need to find the source of that sound, to understand which bell it was, who was ringing it, and why only he, among all the monks in the temple, seemed able to hear it. Finally, one winter morning, after ringing his own bell as usual, Aisin descended the 108 steps and presented himself to the monk who was acting as the temple's guide at that time, a middle-aged man named Zuigan, not because he was the wisest of them all, but because he had been there the longest without missing a single one of his duties. Aisin told him what he had been hearing for the past few months and asked permission to leave the temple for a while in order to search for the source of that sound. Zuigan listened to the entire story without interrupting, staring at the fire burning in the center of the room. When Aisin finished speaking, Zuigan remained silent for a long time, as if pondering something unrelated to the words he had just heard. Finally, he said, "The bell you ring every morning has rung for 20 years without you missing a single day. That is a deep root, Aisin, but a deep root doesn't prevent a tree from also extending its branches to places it can't see from where it's planted. Go, if that's what your heart asks of you. The temple will still be here, the mountain will still be here, and if the bell must ring every morning, we'll find someone to ring it while you're gone. And if I don't return in time to discover why I must ring it?" Aisin asked. "Then you will have discovered something else," Zuigan replied, "and perhaps that something else is precisely what you needed to find." With those words, Aisin received the permission he sought. That very afternoon, he prepared a simple mulberry bag with the essentials for his journey: a change of clothes, a wooden bowl, some dried rice, a thin blanket, and a bamboo walking stick that had belonged to Master Ryokan. Before leaving, he climbed the 108 steps one last time and rang his bell, even though it wasn't the usual hour. The sound fell over the valley just as it did every morning, and Aisin stood there listening as it dissolved into the cold air until nothing remained but silence. At dawn the next day, with the first light barely peeking through the mountains, Aisin crossed the wooden gate of Silent Mountain Temple and began descending the path that led into the valley. He didn't know exactly where he should go. He only knew that the sound of the distant bell came from somewhere among the western mountains, and that his body, in some way he couldn't explain, seemed to know which way to walk. The river and the empty net. The path descended among pines and moss-covered rocks, and after 2 days of steady walking, Asin reached a wide valley through which flowed a slow-moving greenish river. It was neither a mighty nor a noisy river. It flowed with the calm of one who, after many centuries, has learned that there is no hurry to reach the sea. On the bank, half hidden among tall reeds, lay a small wooden boat, and seated inside, mending a net with rough, patient hands, was an old man with skin weathered by the sun and wind. Asin approached and asked if the man knew of any temple or shrine beyond the river, any place where an ancient bell might exist, perhaps abandoned, perhaps forgotten among the ruins of a past war. The fisherman, whose name was Ijin, stopped mending the net and watched the monk for a long moment, as if calculating something unrelated to the question. "There are many ruins beyond the river," he said finally, "and many stories about lost bells. But before you go on your way, may I tell you something I learned many years ago, when I was still young and convinced that fishing depended solely on my own efforts?" Ijin, who was in no real hurry, though his heart pounded with the urgency of finding the bell, sat down on a rock by the river and agreed to listen. Asin recounted that as a young man, he had been the most ambitious fisherman in the entire valley. He would set out before everyone else, return after everyone else, and spend hours mending his nets so they wouldn't have a single hole, convinced that a perfect net would guarantee a perfect catch. For years, that obsession paid off. His nets caught more fish than any other fisherman's in the valley, and his family never went hungry. But over time, Asin began to notice that he needed to catch more and more fish to feel satisfied. If he caught 10 fish one day, the next day he needed to catch 12. If he caught 12, he soon needed 15. Yesterday's sufficiency was never enough the next day. One summer afternoon, while mending his net by the river, an old monk passing by on the path stopped to watch him. Asin, proud of his work, showed him the net and explained in detail how each knot was tied so that no fish, not even the smallest, could escape. The old monk listened attentively and then simply asked, "And what do you do with the fish you don't need?" Asin didn't understand the question at first. He explained that he sold the surplus at the village market, that nothing was wasted, that every catch had a useful purpose. The old monk nodded, but persisted. "I'm not asking you what you do with the fish left over from your need. I'm asking you what you do with the need left over from your life." That question lingered in Asin's mind for months, like a small thorn that didn't hurt enough to pull out, but didn't disappear on its own either. He continued fishing with the same intensity as always, until one day, during a sudden storm, his boat capsized in the middle of the river, and his entire net, the perfect net he had spent years perfecting, sunk and was lost among the rocks on the riverbed. Asin managed to reach the shore alive, but with nothing but the wet clothes he was wearing. For the next few days, without a net or a boat, Asin was forced to fish with his bare hands, standing in the shallow waters near the shore, catching only 1 or 2 small fish each day. And it was precisely during those days of scarcity, Asin told monk Asin many years later, that he experienced something he had never felt during the years of plenty, a strange, almost ethereal calm, knowing exactly how much he needed, and not a single grain of rice more. "I built a new net, of course," Asin continued, gesturing to the one draped over her legs, "but this time I deliberately made it with larger holes. The smaller fish escape through those holes, and only the ones I really need for the day get caught. At first, my neighbors thought I'd lost my mind. A net with large holes seemed like a waste, a silly idea. But over the years, they came to understand something different. I caught less than they did, but I rested more. They caught more than I did, but they were never hungry. Asin listened attentively to the whole story, feeling that the fisherman's words carried a weight that went beyond the fishing itself. He thought about his own life in the temple, about the bell he had rung for 20 years, without really wondering what he needed from that task, beyond fulfilling it. He also thought about the restlessness that now drove him to search for the source of a distant sound, and he wondered, for the first time, if that search stemmed from a genuine need or from a web he had unwittingly woven with holes that were too small. Do you think that searching for that bell is a way of weaving a net with small holes? Asin asked, almost speaking more to himself than to the fisherman. Asin smiled, showing few teeth, but a kind expression. I don't know, monk. Only you can know if you're searching for that bell because your life truly needs it, or because once you heard its ring, your mind decided that without finding it, you'd never be complete. They're different things, even if they seem the same from the outside. They remained silent for a while, listening to the sound of the water gliding over the river stones. The sun was beginning its descent in the west, tinting the greenish waters orange, and the shadows of the reeds stretched across the bank like slender fingers pointing toward an invisible path. Cross the river at the stone ford a little further on, Asin finally said, pointing north. On the other side, you'll find a path that leads up to a small village. There lives a weaver who might be able to help you more than I can. She knows stories of these mountains that I never learned. Asin thanked the fisherman with a deep bow, and before leaving, she asked one last thing. And you, Asin, didn't you ever feel curious to look for something beyond this river? Something to fill that emptiness you felt when you caught more fish than you needed? Asin remained lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the current. Yes, for a long time I felt that curiosity. But one day I understood that curiosity and lack aren't always the same, even though they feel the same deep inside. I learned to distinguish between the two, and that was enough for me. You're still learning that difference, monk. There's no rush. The river is in no hurry, and yet it always reaches the sea. With those words as farewell, Asin crossed the stone ford, feeling the cold water brush against the hem of his tunic, and continued his journey north, carrying not only the satchel with his meager belongings, but also the question the fisherman had planted in his mind, a question that would stay with him for the rest of his journey. Was he searching for the bell because his life truly needed it, or because, without realizing it, he had woven a web with holes too small to let in the peace he already possessed? The path to the weaver's village climbed gently through fields of golden barley, and as Asin walked, the sun slowly dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of violet that reflected in the small puddles left by the recent rain. That night, Asin slept beneath a solitary tree in the middle of a field, wrapped in his thin blanket, listening to the chirping of the night insects and waiting in vain for the sound of the distant bell. That night, for the first time since he had begun to listen for it, the sound did not come. Asin didn't know if this was a sign that he was moving away from the source of the sound or getting too close, and this uncertainty, instead of unsettling him, brought him a strange tranquility, similar to the one Asin had described when speaking of his days of scarcity by the river. The thread that must not be cut. The following midday, Asin arrived at a small village built around a packed earth square, with dark wooden houses and sloping roofs to let the winter snow fall. In the center of the village, under an open shed, a middle-aged woman worked at a wooden loom, moving her hands with a precision that seemed to require no conscious effort, as if her fingers knew the path of the thread better than her own mind. Her name was Sigurd, and she was known throughout the region for weaving the finest fabrics to be found for 100 kilometers around. Asin approached the shed and waited, without interrupting, until Sigurd finished a row of weaving and looked up. She explained her quest. The sound of a distant bell, the mountains to the west, the possibility of ancient ruins where perhaps the source of that ringing lay hidden. Sigurd listened attentively, and when Asin finished speaking, he smiled in a way that suggested the story wasn't entirely unfamiliar to him. Many years ago, when I was young, my teacher taught me to weave on this very loom, Sigurd said, gesturing to the weathered wooden frame. And she also taught me something I've never forgotten, something that might be helpful to you in your quest, monk. Asin, remembering the fisherman's lesson by the river, sat down on a nearby log and prepared to listen. Sigurd recounted how, when he was an apprentice, he made a serious mistake one day in the middle of a tapestry he had been weaving for weeks for the most important family in the village. A thread had twisted at a critical point, almost in the center of the design, and the error was visible to anyone who looked closely at the fabric. Desperate, young Sigurd wanted to undo all the work from the beginning to erase any trace of that mistake. She ran to her teacher crying and begged permission to start again. Her teacher, an old woman named Rakulo, approached the loom, stared at the twisted thread for a long time, and then said something Sigurd didn't expect. "Don't cut that thread." "But the design is ruined," protested young Sigurd. "Anyone who sees this tapestry will notice the mistake." "Anyone who looks for the mistake will find it," Rakula replied. "But that doesn't mean the mistake is the only thing that exists in this fabric. Keep weaving, and instead of trying to hide the crooked thread, weave around it as if it was always meant to be there." Aki. Confused but obedient, Sigurd continued her work over the following weeks, carefully weaving around the twisted thread, gradually incorporating it into a pattern that, at first, made no sense to her. But as the tapestry progressed, the twisted thread began to blend into a larger design, a small branch branching off from an embroidered tree, a detail that, far from ruining the composition, lent it an air of natural asymmetry, unlike any other tapestry in the region. When she finally delivered the tapestry to the family who had commissioned it, Sigurd expected a reprimand for the visible error. In contrast, the family especially praised that crooked branch, saying it gave the embroidered tree a more vibrant appearance, more like the real trees that grew twisted by the wind on mountain slopes, rather than the perfect, symmetrical trees that appeared in common tapestries. From that day forward, Sigurd continued, looking at Eisen with a serene expression. "I stopped weaving in pursuit of perfection and began weaving in pursuit of wholeness. These are different things. Perfection demands that nothing goes wrong. Integrity only demands that what goes wrong is honestly incorporated into the whole, instead of being hidden or violently removed." Eisen remained silent, reflecting on her own life. She thought about the 20 years she had spent ringing the bell without questioning why, about the distant sound she had heard without seeking it, about the restlessness that now propelled her toward an uncertain destiny. She wondered if her very quest was like that twisted thread, something unplanned, disrupting the orderly pattern of her monastic life. But perhaps, if she allowed it to integrate honestly instead of resisting it, it could become something meaningful, even if that meaning was not yet visible. "And the bell I seek?" Eisen asked. "Is it a twisted thread in my life, something I should simply accept without trying to fix it?" Sigurd laughed softly. A brief laugh meant not to mock, but to lighten the conversation. I don't know, monk. I only weave fabrics, not destinies. But I'll tell you something that might help. If you search for the bell intending to cut the twisted thread of your unease and return to your former life exactly as it was, you'll probably suffer along the way. But if you search for the bell willing to weave around whatever you find, without demanding that the final result be perfect, or confirm what you already wanted to know, then your search itself will become a part of your life, not an interruption of it. Eisen stayed in the village that night, accepting Sigur's hospitality, who offered him a corner of the shelter to sleep in next to the loom. Before going to sleep, he looked at the half-finished tapestry hanging from the wooden frame, a landscape of mountains and rivers woven with threads of varying shades of blue and green, and noticed, near the bottom edge, a small, irregular knot that broke the symmetry of the overall pattern. He didn't ask if that knot had been a mistake or a deliberate choice. He simply observed it and felt he understood something that Sigur's words hadn't quite explained. That night, as he slept, Eisen dreamed of the distant bell. In the dream, the bell had no fixed shape. Sometimes it looked like ancient bronze. Sometimes it looked like it was woven with colorful threads. Sometimes it looked like it was made of the same silence that surrounded the silent mountain temple. When she awoke, with the first light of dawn filtering through the boards of the shed, she couldn't clearly recall any images from the dream, only a lingering sense of calm, similar to what she had felt by the river listening to the fisherman Isin. Sigurd was already awake, preparing some rice and vegetables for breakfast. When Isin thanked her for her hospitality and prepared to continue his journey, she pointed out a path that climbed westward, beyond the barley fields, toward an area of dense woods where, according to the oldest travelers, lay the ruins of a village destroyed in a war many generations ago. There you will find a blacksmith named Taidio, Sigurd said. He lives alone near the ruins and forges tools for the few travelers who dare to venture into the woods. Perhaps he knows something more about the bell you seek, and if he doesn't, at least he'll give you something useful for the journey that still lies ahead. Isin thanked her again with a deep bow and set off toward the forest, carrying the weaver's words in his heart like another thread, perhaps twisted, perhaps not, slowly becoming part of the still unfinished tapestry of his own life. The sword that was never tempered. The forest was denser than Isin had imagined. The trees grew so close together that the sunlight filtered in tiny fragments, painting shifting patches on the ground covered with dry leaves and damp moss. He walked for almost a whole day before he heard, amidst the silence of the forest, the rhythmic and unmistakable sound of a hammer striking metal. Following the sound, Isin came to a clearing where a small stone forge stood, its chimney billowing a steady stream of grey smoke. Beside the forge, a broad-shouldered man with arms covered in small scars hammered a glowing metal bar on an anvil darkened by use. His name was Tahiru, and his face, illuminated by the orange glow of the fire, displayed such deep concentration that it seemed almost a form of meditation. Isin waited until Tahiru had finished shaping the piece he was working on before approaching. When the blacksmith finally plunged the metal into a bucket of water, producing a brief puff of steam and a sharp hiss, he turned to the monk and regarded him with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly warm. "Few travelers cross this forest," Tahiru said, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "What are you looking for here, monk?" Isin explained his quest once more. The sound of the distant bell, the ruins of the destroyed village, the possibility that some vestige of that ancient sound might be hidden among the nearby rubble. Tahiru listened silently, and when Isin finished, he nodded slowly, as if the story had awakened an ancient memory he hadn't revisited in a long time. "The ruins are midday to the north," Tairyu said. "But before you go on, let me offer you some food and a place to rest. The path there is treacherous, especially for someone unfamiliar with the forest." Isin gratefully accepted, and that night, sitting by the forge fire while the blacksmith prepared a simple stew of roots and wild mushrooms, he listened to a story Tairyu told unprompted, as if he needed to share it with someone after a long silence. Tairyu recounted that many years ago, he had been an apprentice to a legendary master blacksmith, a man capable of forging swords so sharp they could cut a feather floating in mid-air, and so strong they would never break, no matter how many battles they endured. Tahiryu's dream, from the very first day of his apprenticeship, had been to forge a sword even more perfect than his master's, an absolute sword, without any flaws, capable of withstanding any imaginable test. For years, Tairyu experimented with different techniques, different firing temperatures, different cooling times, always seeking to eliminate any microscopic imperfection in the metal. Each sword he forged was better than the last, but none reached the absolute perfection he envisioned. With each failed attempt, he grew more obsessive, more demanding of himself, until his master, concerned, warned him, "Tairyu, a sword isn't meant to be perfect. It exists to fulfill its function when it is needed. If you keep seeking absolute perfection, you will forget what a sword is truly for." Tairyu did not heed that warning. He continued his quest for many more years, even after his master's death, gradually isolating himself from the other smiths in the region, convinced that only he understood the true nature of artisanal perfection. He built his forge in that solitary forest, far from all distractions, and dedicated every hour of his life to trying to forge the perfect sword he had envisioned in his youth. One day, after more than a decade of failed attempts, Tairyu finally succeeded in forging a sword that, according to all his tests, was flawless. The blade was perfectly straight, the edge cutting with astonishing precision. The metal showed no cracks or visible imperfections, even in the brightest light. Tairyu held the sword for hours, examining it from every angle, hoping to feel the satisfaction he had imagined during so many years of work. But instead, he felt something entirely different, a strange, almost painful emptiness, because having achieved the goal he had pursued throughout his adult life, he didn't know what to do with it. The perfect sword hung on the forge wall for months, unused by Tairyu, unsold, unshown to anyone. It simply hung there, gleaming in the gloom, a silent reminder that perfection, once attained, brought no additional meaning beyond what existed before it was achieved. One afternoon, a wounded traveler staggered to the forge, pursued by bandits who ravaged that region of the forest. Without hesitation, Tairyu grabbed the perfect sword from the wall and went to defend the traveler. In the brief but violent confrontation that followed, the perfect sword fulfilled its purpose, protecting a life. But at the end of the fight, Tairyu noticed that the once flawless blade now bore a small nick near the tip, the result of colliding with one of the bandits' weapons. For the first time in years, Tairyu felt something akin to joy as he gazed at the imperfect sword. The chip didn't represent failure. It represented the one moment the sword had truly fulfilled its purpose. From that day forward, Tairyu said, gazing into the forge's fire as he finished his story, I stopped forging in pursuit of absolute perfection. Now I forge tools and weapons that serve the purposes people truly need. Chopping wood, ploughing the land, defending themselves against real danger. They are imperfect tools, with minor variations that no discerning buyer would accept. but they are tools that get used. And a tool that is used is worth more than a perfect sword that merely hangs on a wall, admired but useless. Isin remained silent, thinking about his own bell, about the 20 years he had rung it without questioning its purpose, about the current quest that had led him to this remote forest. He wondered if somehow he was searching for a perfect version of something that already fulfilled its function in its imperfect, everyday form, the simple sound of a bronze bell, rung every morning, without any need to be the oldest, largest, or most mysterious bell in the world. Do you think I'm looking for something I already had, without knowing it, in my own temple? Isin asked. Tario shrugged, stirring the embers of the fire with a long stick. I can't answer that for you, monk. But let me tell you this. If at the end of your search you discover that the bell you were looking for was less important than the journey you took to find it, don't think you wasted your time. It took me a decade to discover that my obsession with perfection had led me astray from the very reason I had begun forging swords in the first place. To protect something, to serve a purpose, to be useful to someone beyond myself. That night, Isin slept beside the forge, enveloped in the residual heat of the slowly dying fire. Before he went to sleep, Tario gave him a small iron knife, simple but well forged, without any unnecessary decoration. Stop on the road, he said simply. The ruins you seek are beyond a small stream, to the north. Be careful. They say that an old man, blind for many years, still lives in those ruins, yet he knows those mountains better than anyone with sight. Isin thanked them for the gift and the information, and at dawn the next day, after bidding Tario farewell with a deep bow, he continued his journey north, carrying in his satchel not only the iron knife, but also the silent lesson about the difference between perfection and utility, between obsession and purpose. To see without eyes. The stream Tario had mentioned appeared at midday, a trickle of clear water running between stones covered in orange lichen. Isin crossed it without difficulty, and soon after leaving it behind, the forest began to open up into a more open area, where the trees gave way to a field covered in ruins. Collapsed stone walls, columns broken in half, and what must once have been cobbled streets, now overgrown with tall grass and wild vines. Isin wandered among the ruins for hours, examining every wall, every pile of stones, searching for any sign of a bell or an ancient temple. The sun was beginning to set when he found, at the far end of what appeared to have been a central plaza, a small hut built from the same stone fragments as the surrounding ruins, with a makeshift roof of branches and dry leaves. In front of the hut, seated on a flat rock, an old man with completely white hair was weaving a basket from thin willow branches. Isin noticed as he approached that his eyes were covered by a whitish cloud, indicating total blindness, probably for many years, and yet his hands moved with astonishing dexterity, interlacing the branches with a precision that seemed to require no sense of sight whatsoever. I've been hearing your footsteps for quite some time now, monk, the old man said without turning his head. You walk with the uncertainty of someone searching for something without knowing exactly what it looks like. Isin, surprised, introduced himself and briefly explained his search. The old man, whose name was Bison, set aside the half-finished basket and, for the first time, turned his face toward Isin, though his blind eyes could not return his gaze. These ruins were once a thriving village, with a small shrine at its center, Bison said. Many generations ago, during a war that no one remembers in detail anymore, the village was destroyed and the shrine reduced to rubble. It is said that a bell hung in that shrine, a bell cast by a master craftsman whose name has been lost to time. But I have lived among these ruins for almost 40 years, monk, and I have never heard the sound of any bell, neither by day nor by night. Aisin felt his heart sink a little at that. He had travelled a long way. He had heard valuable stories from a fisherman, a weaver, and a blacksmith, but none of those stories had truly brought him closer to the source of the sound he sought. He sat on the ground, facing the old man, feeling for the first time the weight of the fatigue accumulated during days of walking. I lost my sight 40 years ago, in a fire that also destroyed almost everything I owned, Aisin continued, as if he had sensed the monk's discouragement without him saying a word. For the first few years after that fire, I lived in profound despair. I constantly thought about everything I could no longer see. The colors of the sunrise, my late wife's face, the mountains I had admired my entire life. Each day that passed without my sight returning felt like a repeated punishment, as if the whole world were punishing me for no reason. Aisin paused, picking up the wicker basket and continuing his work as he spoke. One day, a traveler passing through these ruins asked me why I still lived in a destroyed place, surrounded by rubble I couldn't even see. I replied bitterly that it didn't matter where I lived, because I couldn't see anywhere anymore. The traveler, however, told me something that completely changed my understanding of my own blindness. He said, "You have lost sight in your eyes, but you speak as if you have also lost sight in your mind." Aisin listened attentively, sensing that this story, though different in its form from the previous ones, touched on something similar at its core. At first, I didn't understand his words, Aisin continued, but over time I realized that he had been using my physical blindness as an excuse not to see anything else, not the possibilities still before me, not the people around me, not the beauty that still existed in the world, even though I couldn't perceive it with my eyes. I began to train my other senses, hearing, touch, smell, even a kind of inner sense I don't know how to name, but which allows me to perceive the shape of things, the direction of the wind, the presence of another person, before I clearly hear their footsteps. The old man lifted the half-finished basket, showing it toward where he assumed Aisin's face was. "This basket, monk, I weave without seeing a single one of the branches I intertwine, and yet it is a functional, sturdy basket, capable of carrying weight without breaking. Do you know why I can weave it without seeing?" The old man could not see this gesture, and answered aloud that he did not know. "Because I learned to trust my hands more than my eyes," Aisin replied. "Throughout my sighted life, I relied on my eyes to verify every movement, every knot, every detail of my work. When I lost my sight, my hands had to learn to trust their own knowledge, accumulated over years of practice, without needing the constant confirmation of my gaze. And I discovered, to my surprise, that my hands knew more than my eyes had ever allowed me to acknowledge." Aisin remained silent, thinking about the bell he was searching for, the sound that only he seemed able to hear among all the monks in the temple. He wondered if this ability to hear something others couldn't perceive had any connection to what the old man was describing, a form of knowledge that didn't depend on external confirmation, but on an inner trust, cultivated through years of silent practice. "Perhaps I'm not looking for a bell that others can see or hear," Aisin said, more to himself than to the old man. "Perhaps I'm looking to confirm something I already know, without needing anyone else to confirm it for me." Aisin smiled, a broad smile that deeply creased his weathered face. "That, monk, is something only you can discover. But I will tell you one thing. If the sound you hear has brought you to these ruins, to this hut, to this conversation with me, then that sound has already served a purpose, regardless of whether or not you find a physical bell at the end of your journey. That night, Bison offered Eisen a place to sleep inside his hut, sheltered from the cold wind that blew through the ruins. Before going to sleep, the old man told him about a lake a day's journey north. A lake where, he said, lived a solitary ferryman named Canthan, who knew all the stories and legends of that region better than anyone. If there is any more concrete answer about the origin of that bell you hear, Bison said, before they both fell asleep, Canthan probably knows it. But I warn you, monk, not all the answers we seek come in the form we expect. Eisen slept soundly that night, more soundly than he had since leaving the Silent Mount Temple, and he dreamed not of any bell, neither near nor far, but of a vast, tranquil silence, similar to what he imagined the old man Bison must feel each night, surrounded by a darkness that no longer frightened him, the lake that changed its face. The next day, Eisen bid Bison farewell with a profound bow and a gratitude beyond words. Before letting him go, the old man gave him a small wicker basket, smaller than those he usually wove, saying it would be useful for carrying any offering he wished to leave in the lake, if that custom was still practiced in that region. The road north led through an area of low hills covered in yellowing grass, and toward late afternoon, Eisen finally reached the shore of a vast lake, whose waters reflected the sky with such clarity that it was difficult to distinguish where the real world ended and its reflection began. On the shore, tied to a weathered wooden post, floated a small boat, and seated beside it, mending an oar with a rope of plant fiber, was a man of indeterminate age, his face weathered by sun and water, and his serene expression seemingly honed by years of silent contemplation before the lake. Bison told me I might run into you, the man said, before Eisen could introduce himself. My name is Kanzan. I've been crossing this lake back and forth for more years than I can count. Eisen explained his quest once more, though he noticed that with each repetition of the tale, his own words sounded different, as if the story itself had shifted slightly after each encounter. The fisherman, the weaver, the blacksmith, the blind old man. Kanzan listened attentively, and when Eisen finished, he pointed to the other side of the lake, where a light mist partially obscured the opposite shore. On the other side of this lake is an ancient temple, much older than yours, Kanzan said. It is said that the master craftsman who cast the bell you seek lived there many generations ago. But before I take you there, let me tell you something about this lake, which might help you better understand what you're looking for. Eisen sat on a flat stone near the shore, watching the last rays of sunset paint the waters in shades of gold and pink. As Kanzan began his story, when I was young, I started working as I learned from another boatman, an older man, who knew every current, every submerged rock, every variation in depth of this lake. During my early years of learning, I memorized the lake as if it were a fixed, unchanging map. Here a dangerous rock, there a strong current, further on an area of calm water where it was safe to stop and rest. I trusted that mental map completely, and for a long time it served me well. Kanzan paused, watching the water gently swaying before them. But one day, during a sudden storm, my boat struck a rock that, according to my mental map, shouldn't have been there. Fortunately, the boat didn't sink, but the impact was enough to frighten me deeply. When I finally reached the shore, I ran to tell my master what had happened, convinced I had made a navigational error. My master, however, asked me a question I hadn't expected. When was the last time you checked if that rock is anchored in exactly the same place? Aishin listened intently, sensing that the story was heading towards something important. I confessed that I hadn't looked at it in years because I simply trusted the map I had memorized during my apprenticeship. My teacher then explained something that completely changed my relationship with this lake. The rocks at the bottom move slowly, with every storm, with every season of heavy rains. The currents change direction with the seasons. Even the depth varies throughout the year, depending on the melting snow from the nearby mountains. The lake I had memorized in my first year of study no longer existed in the same form 10 years later. Although the lake's name and its general appearance from the shore remained the same. Since then, Kanzan continued, I've learned to cross this lake not by relying on a fixed map, but by observing the signs present each day. The color of the water, the direction of the wind, the way the light reflects on the surface. Today's lake isn't exactly yesterday's lake, even though they share the same name and occupy the same general space in the landscape, and yet I can cross it safely every day. Not because I know an unchanging map, but because I've learned to read its constant changes. Aisin remained silent for a long time, watching the last light of sunset disappear behind the hills, leaving the lake shrouded in a bluish twilight. He thought about the bell he was searching for, the sound he had heard night after night from the silent mountain temple, and wondered if that sound, like Lake Kanzan, also changed with time, with the seasons, with the position of the listener. He wondered if the bell he finally found, if he ever did, would be exactly the same bell whose sound had driven him to leave the temple, or if, by then, both the bell and he himself would have changed enough that the encounter would no longer mean what he had imagined along the way. Do you think the bell I'm looking for will still ring the same way when I finally find it? Aisin asked. Kanzan smiled, gently pushing the boat into the shallow water near the shore. I don't think so, monk, but I also don't think that's cause for sadness. Get in the boat. We'll cross the lake at dawn when the waters are calmer. Tonight, rest here with me by the fire I'm going to light. And let me tell you one last thing before you go to sleep. Aisin climbed ashore next to Kanzan, and as the ferryman lit a small fire with dry branches gathered near the lake, he continued speaking in a lower voice, almost as if sharing a secret he hadn't shared with many people before. Some years ago, I guided another traveler across this lake, a merchant desperately seeking to recover a fortune he had lost in a bad business deal. Throughout the crossing, the merchant kept talking about what he would do when he got his fortune back, about the life he would resume exactly where he had left off before losing everything. I asked him at some point if he had ever considered that perhaps he didn't need to recover exactly what he had lost, but rather build something different with what he had left. He became angry with me and told me that I didn't understand anything about what it meant to lose something truly valuable. Kanzan stirred the fire with a thin stick, watching the sparks briefly rise into the dark sky before dying out. I never knew what happened to that merchant after crossing the lake, but I think of him often, especially when I guide other travelers who, like you, are searching for something specific on the other side of these waters, and I always wonder the same thing. What happens when we finally arrive where we thought we needed to go, and discover that neither the destination nor ourselves are exactly what we imagined along the way? Aisin didn't answer that question, because he knew he didn't yet have a clear answer. He simply stayed by the fire, feeling the warmth on his face and the night's chill on his back, listening to the gentle sound of the water lapping against the shore, until finally sleep overtook him, without any bell, near or far, interrupting his rest. The sunken temple in the mist. Kanzan woke Aisin before dawn, when the sky was just beginning to clear behind the eastern hills. The lake was shrouded in a thick mist that floated across the water's surface like a white veil, and the early morning chill compelled Isin to wrap himself more tightly in his blanket before climbing into the small boat. "The mist will dissipate as we move forward," Kansen said, propelling the boat into the calm waters with a firm stroke of the oar. "It's always like this at this time of day. The lake is shrouded in mist just before dawn, as if it needs a moment of rest, hidden, before revealing itself again in the daylight." They rowed for almost 2 hours, through the mist that gradually began to dissipate as the sun climbed over the mountains, until finally the opposite shore became visible, a strip of rocky land where twisted, ancient trees grew, and among them, barely distinguishable through the vegetation, the remains of what had been, generations ago, a temple of considerable size. Kansen guided the boat to a small stone landing, half collapsed but still usable, and helped Isin ashore. "This is as far as I can take you, monk," Kansen said. "What you find beyond these ruins no longer depends on me, but on your own path. I will wait for you here by the boat for 3 days. If you have not returned by the 3rd day, I will understand that your search has led you down a different path than the one we both imagined, and I will return alone to my side of the lake." Isin was deeply grateful to Kansen for his help, and with his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension, he ventured into the gnarled trees toward the ruins of the ancient temple. Unlike the ruins of the village where Bison lived, these ruins seemed even older, covered by centuries of moss and roots that had invaded every crack in the original stone. Isin walked among fallen columns and crumbling walls until he reached what must have been the temple's central courtyard, where, against all odds, a partially destroyed stone tower still stood, similar in structure to the tower where he himself rang its bell every morning on Silent Mountain. At the foot of the tower, seated on a fallen stone block, a very old man, dressed in a robe so worn its original color was barely discernible, patiently carved a small piece of wood with a small knife. Hearing Isin's footsteps, he looked up without startling, as if he had been expecting his arrival for a long time. "Few visitors come this far," the old man said, his voice surprisingly firm for his age, "and even fewer come following the sound of a bell that no longer exists." Isin felt his heart stop for a moment. "It's gone?" he asked, unable to hide the disappointment in his voice. The old man pointed toward the base of the tower, where, among the rubble and vegetation, dark fragments of metal could be distinguished, so corroded by time that they barely retained the original shape they must have once had. That bell was cast more than 300 years ago by a master craftsman named Genmyo, whose name only a few old folks like myself still remember, the old man said. It is said that Genmyo spent his entire life perfecting the bronze alloy from which he cast that bell, seeking to create a sound that could travel farther than that of any other bell ever made, a sound capable of piercing mountains and reaching the most remote temples in the region, as a way of uniting all the monasteries under a single call. The old man continued carving his piece of wood as he spoke, without looking up. For many years, the Genmyo bell served its purpose. Its sound did indeed travel astonishing distances, and it is said that several distant temples adjusted their own prayer times, according to the far-off ringing that reached them from this temple. But 300 years ago, during a war that devastated much of this region, a group of soldiers sacked this temple and toppled the tower, sending the bell plummeting from a considerable height. The impact shattered it into several fragments, and although some surviving monks tried to rebuild it for years, they were never able to restore the original sound that Genmyo had created. Aishin approached the dark metal fragments, touching them carefully, feeling the cold, rough texture of the corroded bronze beneath his fingers. Then, the sound you've been hearing these past few months began. Aishin, unsure how to finish his question. "It doesn't come from this bell, monk," the old man replied, finally looking up at Aishin. "This bell has been silent for 300 years, but that doesn't mean the sound you heard wasn't real, or that your search was in vain." Aishin sat down on a nearby stone block, feeling a confusing mix of disappointment and curiosity at the old man's words. "Let me tell you something more about Genmyo, something that might help you understand what you've truly been searching for," the old man continued. "Before casting this bell, Genmyo spent 20 years studying the sound of older bells, traveling throughout the region, listening to and memorizing every nuance of tone he encountered. His disciples recounted that during that time, Genmyo developed an extraordinary ability to hear sounds that others could not perceive. Subtle vibrations in metal, echoes that bounced between mountains in ways that most people didn't even notice." The old man set aside his wood carving, folding his hands in his lap. It is said that toward the end of his life, Genmyo no longer needed to hear a physical bell to perceive its sound. He could imagine, with astonishing accuracy, exactly how a bell cast with a specific proportion of bronze and copper, a certain wall thickness, and a specific clapper shape would sound, simply by visualizing it in his mind. Some of his most devoted disciples even came to believe that Genmyo, in his later years, no longer cast bells to create a new sound, but rather to materialize a sound that already existed, in some way, within his own inner perception. Aishin listened to all of this with an attention that went beyond mere curiosity, feeling that the old man's words touched something deeply connected to his own experience of the past few months. "Are you suggesting that the sound I heard didn't come from any physical bell, but from my own perception?" Aishin asked, a mixture of skepticism and openness in his voice. "I don't know for sure, monk." "No one can know for sure," the old man replied. "But I will ask you a question, similar to one you may have asked yourself along this long journey. Do you ring your bell each morning because you need to hear its sound? Or do you ring your bell each morning because you need to remind yourself of something you already know, something the sound simply confirms?" Aishin remained silent for a long time, staring at the dark fragments of the shattered bell, thinking of the 20 years of climbing the 108 steps each morning, of waiting for the light to touch the distant mountain, of pulling the rope and letting the sound fall upon the valley. He thought of Master Ryokan's instruction: "Ring the bell when the light touches the mountain, and one day you will understand why." And for the first time, he felt he was beginning to understand something, even though he couldn't yet fully express it in words. "The master who founded my temple told me that one day I would understand why I had to ring the bell at that exact moment," Aishin said, almost speaking to himself. "For 20 years I thought that understanding would come from outside, like a revelation someone else would give me. But perhaps the understanding I sought was never outside of me. Perhaps every morning, as I rang the bell, I was already touching upon that understanding without realizing I possessed it." The old man smiled, a gentle smile that neither confirmed nor denied Aishin's words, but simply accompanied them. "Stay here tonight, monk," he said. "Tomorrow, before you return with the ferryman, I want to show you something that might finally clarify what you've begun to understand." Aishin agreed, and that night he slept among the ruins of the ancient temple, wrapped in his blanket, listening to the wind that rustled through the fallen columns and twisted trees. He heard no bells that night, neither distant nor near, and for the first time since his journey began, this absence of sound caused him no unease. The lesson of Master Genmyo. At dawn, the old man woke Aishin with a cup of hot tea brewed over a small makeshift fire among the courtyard stones. They drank in silence for a while, watching as the sunlight began to filter through the twisted trees, gradually illuminating the dark fragments of the fallen bell. "Come with me," the old man finally said, rising with difficulty, leaning on a walking stick carved from the same wood he had been working on the night before. "There is something else I must show you before you return to your temple." He led Aishin through the ruins, toward a small stone structure that had survived almost intact the destruction of the rest of the temple, hidden behind a dense grove of trees that shielded it from casual view. Inside, barely illuminated by the light that filtered through a narrow opening in the roof, stood a small stone altar, and upon it, carefully preserved despite the passage of centuries, a rolled-up scroll, which the old man unrolled with trembling but careful hands. "This is the only remaining record of Genmyo's teachings," the old man said, holding the scroll up so Aishin could examine the characters faded by time. "For generations, the few guardians who have watched over these ruins have protected this document, hoping that one day someone would come who could understand its true meaning." Aishin studied the ancient characters, many of them barely legible, but he managed to make out a few phrases that the old man helped him decipher, translating the archaic language in which they were written. The scroll recounted that Genmyo, toward the end of his life, had reached an understanding he considered more important than any bell he had ever cast. The true purpose of a bell was not to produce a sound that traveled the farthest possible, but to create a moment of shared pause between the one who rang the bell and the one who heard its sound, regardless of the distance between them. Genmyo wrote that he had spent the first half of his life obsessed with the distance his sound could reach, believing that a larger, more resonant, more perfect bell would unite more people under a single call. But toward the end of his life, he understood that the union he sought depended not on the size or distance of the sound, but on the intention with which each person in each distant temple paused to listen. "Genmyo wrote here," the old man continued, pointing to a specific section of the scroll, that the smallest bell, rung with full presence, fulfilled the same function as the largest bell ever cast, provided that the one who rang it and the one who listened were truly present in that shared moment. He wrote that he had wasted 20 years of his life pursuing an external greatness that could never equal the simple greatness of a moment of mindfulness. Aishin felt those words resonate deeply within his own experience, touching upon something he had begun to understand the night before amidst the dark fragments of the fallen bell. "Why are you showing me this now?" Aishin asked, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. The old man carefully rolled up the parchment, returning it to its place on the stone altar. "Because I believe, monk, that you have traveled a path similar to the one Genmyo traveled throughout his life, albeit in a much shorter time. You left your temple seeking something external, a bell older, more mysterious, more meaningful than the one you already rang each morning. And along the way, without realizing it, you have been discovering, through the stories of a fisherman, a weaver, a blacksmith, and a blind old man, the same understanding that took Genmyo a lifetime to attain." Aishin remained silent, feeling that the pieces of his journey were beginning to fall into place in a pattern he hadn't been able to clearly see until then. He thought of his sin, the fisherman, and his net with large holes, woven deliberately so as not to catch more than necessary. He thought of Sigur, the weaver, and her tapestry with the twisted thread woven into the design instead of being cut. He thought of Tairyu, the blacksmith, and his perfect sword that only acquired true meaning when it fulfilled its imperfect function of protecting a life. he thought of Bison, the blind old man, and his trust in hands that knew more than his eyes had ever allowed him to recognize. And he thought of Tanzan, the ferryman, and his ever-changing lake, crossed safely not by a fixed map, but by a renewed awareness each day. Each of them taught me something different, yet related, Isin said, almost speaking to himself. And now I understand that the bell I sought throughout this journey was perhaps never meant to be found as a physical object, but as an understanding I could only attain by walking this path, listening to these stories, letting each one weave something new into my own understanding of my life in the temple. The old man nodded slowly, leaning on his cane as they walked back toward the central courtyard of the ruined temple. Genmyo also wrote something else toward the end of the parchment. Something I want to share with you before you return to the ferryman, the old man said. He wrote that the greatest mistake he made in his life was believing that understanding, once attained, should be communicated through a permanent object like a bronze bell that could outlive him. But toward the end of his life, he realized that true understanding is not conveyed through objects, but through shared moments, stories told, and silences held together. The bell he cast, however magnificent, was ultimately destroyed by the war, reduced to dark fragments that can no longer ring. But the conversations he had with his disciples, the stories he shared, the questions he planted in their minds, these continue to resonate generation after generation, long after the bronze has corroded into silence. Aizen felt a deep calm settle in his chest, a calm unlike the restlessness that had driven him to leave the temple months before. It wasn't the calm of having found what he sought in the form he had imagined, but the calm of having understood that what he sought had never truly been absent from his life. I must return to my temple, Aizen finally said. There is a bell I must still ring every morning, and now I understand, at least partially, why I must continue to ring it. The old man smiled, accompanying Aizen to the landing where Kanzan waited, just as he had promised, beside the small boat. Go, monk, the old man said as a farewell. And when you ring your bell tomorrow, or the day after, or 20 years from now, remember that the sound you produce doesn't need to travel to the farthest mountains to have meaning. It only needs to be rung with the same full presence you have cultivated during this long journey back to yourself. The journey back, Kanzan rowed back to his side of the lake under a clear sky, a stark contrast to the thick fog that had shrouded the waters 2 days earlier. During the crossing, Aizen recounted everything he had learned from the old guardian of the ruins, the story of Genmyo, the destruction of the bell, and the scroll containing his final teachings. Kanzan listened attentively, rowing with a steady, calm rhythm, and when Aizen finished speaking, he remained silent for a long time, watching the reflection of the mountains on the still surface of the water. You know, monk, Kanzan finally said, I too searched for something many years ago, before I became a ferryman on this lake. Aizen, surprised by this sudden confession, listened intently. When I was young, my father died in a storm similar to the one that almost sank my boat years ago. The one I told you about the first night, Kanzan said. For a long time after his death, I searched for a way to understand why it had happened, why the lake he had crossed his entire life, the same lake I was crossing now, decided that particular night to claim his life. I sought answers in distant temples from fortune tellers who claimed to read destiny in the lines of the hand, from elders who asserted they knew ancient secrets about the balance between water and sky. Kanzan stopped rowing for a moment, allowing the boat to glide gently on the calm waters. None of those searches gave me the answer I thought I needed, And for years, I carried that lack of an answer like an open wound, blaming the lake, blaming the storm, even blaming my own father for not being more careful that night. Until one day, an old monk crossing the lake with me said something I've never forgotten. You look for a reason for what happened, but some things happen for no reason. They just happen. And the real question isn't why it happened, but what you'll do now that it has. Eisen felt that those words carried a weight similar to the stories he had heard throughout his journey. That question changed something in me, Kanzan continued. I stopped searching for a reason for my father's death, and instead decided to honor his memory in the way that seemed most meaningful to me, by becoming a ferryman on this very lake that had taken him, learning to know it as well as he had, so that no other traveler would suffer the same fate through my carelessness or ignorance. And did you find peace in that decision? Eisen asked. I found something different from the peace I had imagined at the beginning of my search. Kanzan replied, I didn't find an answer that explained my father's death, but I found a purpose that gave meaning to my own life. A purpose that didn't depend on fully understanding the past, but on acting carefully in the present. Over the years, I learned that this was perhaps the only peace truly available to me. They reached the shore where they had set out 2 days before, and Kanzan helped Eisen disembark, tying the boat to the same worn post as always. Your path back to the temple will take you past the ruins where Bison lives, past Tairyu's forge, through the village of Sigura, and finally, along the river where Eisen fishes, Kanzan said. Perhaps you'd like to visit them again, now that your search has shifted. Sometimes, the same people teach us different lessons when we visit them with a different mindset than we had the first time. Eisen was deeply grateful to Kanzan, not only for guiding him across the lake, but for sharing such a personal and painful story with a stranger he barely knew. I hope that one day your own distant sound will carry you back to me, monk, Kanzan said in farewell. This lake will always be here, constantly changing, waiting for whoever needs to cross it. With those words, Eisen began his journey back south, carrying in his heart not only the teachings of the Guardian of the Ruins and the scroll of Genmyo, but also Kanzan's personal story, a story that reminded him that each person he had encountered on his journey also carried their own quests, their own losses, their own ways of finding meaning in a world that didn't always offer clear answers. The return to the ruins. The path to the ruins where Bison lived felt different this time, even though the twisted trees, the clear stream, and the crumbling walls were exactly the same ones Eisen had walked through days before. He walked with a different gait, he noticed, slower, less urgent, as if his body had absorbed some of the calm he had found on the other side of the lake. He found Bison in the exact same spot where he had left him, sitting on the flat rock in front of his hut, weaving another basket from thin willow branches. Hearing Eisen's footsteps, the old man raised his face with a smile that suggested he had been expecting this return. You return with a different gait than when you left, monk, Bison said. Tell me what you found on the other side of the lake. Eisen sat down opposite the old man and recounted everything that had happened. The encounter with the Guardian of the Ruins, the story of Genmyo, the destruction of the original bell, and the scroll with its final teachings on inner presence over outward grandeur. Bison listened attentively, without interrupting, nodding occasionally as her hands continued weaving the basket, almost of their own accord. I knew you'd find something different from what you were looking for, Bison said, when Eisen finished her story. That's what usually happens with true quests. But allow me to ask you something, monk. Now that you have traveled this entire path, do you still hear the sound of the distant bell, the one that prompted you to leave your temple? Aisin paused, surprised that he hadn't asked himself that question in the past few days. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the last time he had heard that distinctive ringing that had accompanied him for months before he began his journey. "I haven't heard it since the night I slept among the ruins of the sunken temple," he finally replied, a mixture of surprise and understanding in his voice. "I hadn't noticed until now." Bison nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. Perhaps the sound fulfilled its purpose at the precise moment you no longer needed it to know what you already knew, the old man said, like a candle lit to guide someone through the darkness, which naturally goes out when the light of dawn no longer needs it. Aisin remained silent, feeling both the weight and the lightness of that understanding. After a moment, he decided to share with Bison something he hadn't shared with anyone else during his journey. The lingering doubt about whether, upon returning to the temple, he would find the same satisfaction ringing its bell each morning, or whether the quest he had undertaken would have irreversibly altered his relationship with that daily task. "That's an understandable concern," Bison replied, finally setting aside the half-finished basket. "Let me tell you something more about my own life, something I didn't tell you during your first visit." Aisin settled in, ready to listen. "After losing my sight in the fire I mentioned earlier, and after learning to trust my hands more than my eyes, I went through a period in my life when I felt I had found a definitive peace, an understanding that would never change." Bison began. "I thought, with a certain arrogance that I only recognized years later, that I had reached a kind of final destination on my path to accepting blindness. But life, monk, always respects our final conclusions." "What happened?" Aisin asked. "Years after that initial realization, I also began to lose some of my hearing, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but steadily over time," Bison replied, "and I discovered, to my own surprise and frustration, that all the peace I thought I had attained regarding my blindness did not automatically transfer to this new loss. I had to go through a similar process of despair, bargaining, and finally acceptance, all over again, as if the first time hadn't mattered at all." Aisin listened with renewed tension, feeling that Bison's story directly touched on his own anxieties. "What I learned from that second loss," Bison continued, "is that understanding isn't a place you arrive at once and then stay at forever. It is more like a path traveled repeatedly, each time with different circumstances, each time demanding a new version of the same acceptance. Do not be surprised, monk, if upon returning to your temple you discover that the understanding you gained during this journey needs to be renewed again and again. Each morning you climb the 108 steps to your bell. That does not mean your journey was in vain. It simply means that the practice of mindfulness is not an achievement to be locked away in a chest, but an exercise to be repeated day after day, like the very act of breathing." That night, Aisin slept again in Bison's hut, and before going to sleep, he helped the old man finish the wicker basket he had been working on. Guided by Bison's patient instructions on how to interlace the branches without constantly looking at the result, trusting instead in the feel of his hands and the repetitive rhythm of the weaving. When they said goodbye the next morning, Bison handed him the finished basket, the first one Aisin had ever helped to weave with his own hands, imperfect in places where the loops weren't as uniform as the old man's, but functional and sturdy nonetheless. "Take it with you, monk," Bison said, "and every time you look at it, remember that the ability to weave without constantly looking isn't learned in a single day, or even in a single journey. It's learned by repeating the gesture again and again, trusting a little more each time in what your hands already know. The fire that kept burning, the path through the forest to Taryu's forge seemed shorter this time, perhaps because Eisen already knew the way, or perhaps because his mind, preoccupied with all he had learned, wasn't dwelling so much on measuring the distance traveled. He found the blacksmith exactly where he had left him, hammering a red-hot metal bar with the same steady, focused rhythm. Taryu acknowledged his arrival without completely stopping his work, finishing the current blow before plunging the metal into the bucket of water and turning to face the monk. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon," Taryu said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Eisen, sitting down on the same log where he had sat during his first visit, recounted his entire experience once more. The lake, the sunken temple, the story of Genmyo and his destroyed bell, the scroll with his final teachings, and finally, the silence that had replaced the distant sound that had once driven him to walk. Taryu listened attentively as he stoked the forge fire, adding charcoal with precise and economical movements. "It's curious," the blacksmith said, when Eisen finished his tale. "His story reminds me of something I experienced many years ago, shortly after the experience I told you about the perfect sword that I ultimately used to protect that wounded traveler." Eisen, intrigued, waited for Taryu to continue. "After that incident, I thought I had finally grasped the difference between perfection and utility," Taryu said, "and for several years I forged tools and weapons with that understanding, guiding each of my hammer blows. But one day, a young apprentice came to my forge asking me to teach him the trade, and I discovered, much to my own surprise, that teaching that understanding was far more difficult than simply living it in silence." Taryu took another metal bar and placed it in the fire, waiting for it to reach the right temperature as he continued talking. The young apprentice, eager to quickly master the craft, made constant mistakes, uneven blows, miscalculated temperatures, and crooked shapes that didn't match the design he was trying to achieve. Every time I tried to explain the lesson I had learned about imperfection and its usefulness, he listened impatiently, eager to get straight to producing perfect tools, without going through the long process of trial and error that had taken me years. "What happened to the apprentice?" Eisen asked. "He left after a few months, frustrated because he felt I wasn't teaching him the secrets of the trade quickly enough," Taryu replied, his expression a mixture of resignation and something akin to sadness. "And for a long time after he left, I wondered if I had failed as a teacher, if I should have found a more effective way to convey what I myself had taken so long to understand." Eisen felt that this story touched on a similar concern to the one she had shared with Baisei the night before. The doubt about whether the understanding gained during a personal journey could be directly transmitted to another person, or whether each person needed to walk their own path, with their own mistakes, to reach genuine understanding. "Over time, I understood something important about that experience," Taryu continued, finally taking the metal bar from the fire and placing it on the anvil. "I couldn't forge the apprentice's understanding the same way I forged a metal tool. I could show him the way. I could share my own stories and mistakes, but the final understanding had to be forged by him, through his own hammer blows, his own errors, his own process, which would likely be different from mine, in ways I couldn't even predict." Taryu began hammering the metal with rhythmic movements, shaping what looked like a small sickle for farm work. "Tell me, monk," he said without pausing his work, "when you return to your temple, will you have to teach what you've learned to another monk, in the same way that Master Ryokan left you with an instruction without a complete explanation, trusting that one day you would understand it for yourself?" Eisen pondered the question, realizing that he would probably one day have to pass on the responsibility of ringing the bell to a younger monk, perhaps without being able to fully explain why he had to ring it at that exact moment, just as Ryokan had done for him. Behind the instruction, Aisin answered slowly, as if the understanding were forming as he spoke. Not because he wanted to hide something from me, but because he knew that no verbal explanation could replace the 20-year process of ringing the bell, nor the journey he would eventually undertake to understand it from another perspective. Some understandings can only be forged through experience, blow after blow, year after year. Taryu smiled, continuing to work the hot metal on the anvil. Exactly, monk. And so, when the time comes to pass on your responsibility to another, perhaps the best thing you can do is exactly what Ryokan did for you. Give them the essential instruction and trust that their own path, with their own stories and their own mistakes, will lead them to the understanding they need to reach. That night, Aisin helped Taryu keep the forge fire going, while the blacksmith finished shaping several small tools destined for the farmers of the region. Before going to sleep, Taryu gave her another small gift, a tiny iron bell, barely the size of a walnut, with a clear, high-pitched sound when Aisin gently shook it. It's not as big or as resonant as the bell you ring every morning at your temple, Taryu said, but perhaps it will serve as a reminder that even the smallest sound can carry all the presence we put into making it. Aisin put the bell away next to the wicker basket Baisen had given him, and that night, sleeping by the lingering warmth of the forge, he dreamed again, though this time the dream included no distant or mysterious bell, but simply the repetitive and reassuring image of a hammer striking metal with a steady rhythm, like the beating of a serene heart. The tapestry continuing to grow. Sigur's pole appeared before Aisin in a mid-afternoon light, different from the golden light of sunset that had illuminated his first visit. The weaver was, as always, sitting at her loom under the open shed, though the tapestry she was working on now was different from the one Aisin had observed during his first visit. A design of birds flying over a field of flowers, with colors more vibrant than the mountain and river landscape he had seen before. "I finished that mountain tapestry while you were away," Sigur said, without pausing the movement of his hands over the new design. "The irregular knot you saw near the bottom edge is still there, monk. I decided not to hide it, just as I told you I would." Aisin sat on the same log from his first visit and shared with Sigur everything he had experienced. The lake, the sunken temple, the story of Genmyo, the silence that had replaced the sound of the distant bell, and the renewed conversations with Baisen and Taryu on the way back. Sigur listened attentively, his hands continuing the work of the loom almost automatically, as his mind focused on the monk's story. "Your story reminds me of something I learned after finishing that first tapestry with the twisted thread. The story I told you about my teacher Rakuyo," Sigure said, when Aisin finished speaking. "After that experience, I began deliberately incorporating small irregularities into my tapestries, convinced that this made them more authentic, more alive. But over time, I discovered that I had fallen into a subtle error, different from but related to the original mistake I had made by trying to cut the crooked thread." "What mistake?" Aisin asked, intrigued. "I began to force irregularities where they didn't arise naturally, simply because I had learned that irregularity had value," Sigur replied, pausing for a moment in the movement of his hands. "One day, an elderly woman from the village who had bought several of my tapestries over the years pointed out that my recent designs felt less genuine than my earlier ones, even though they were technically just as skillful. At first, I didn't understand her criticism, but after reflecting on it, I realized that I had transformed the acceptance of imperfection into a new form of perfectionism. Ature, Now he was obsessively searching for the perfect irregularity, instead of simply letting the fabric honestly reflect the natural process of its creation, with its genuine mistakes and its genuine successes, without forcing either. "How did you correct that mistake?" Eisen asked. "I stopped thinking in terms of perfection and imperfection altogether," Sigurd replied, resuming her work at her loom. "Instead, I began to simply ask myself whether I was present while weaving, whether my hands were moving with genuine attention, or whether my mind was wandering to other thoughts while my body worked mechanically. I eventually discovered that when I wove with true presence, some irregularities arose naturally and others did not. And both results were equally honest, equally valuable, because they reflected the actual state of my attention at each moment of the process, rather than a preconceived idea of what the final result should look like." Eisen thought about his own relationship with the temple bell, wondering if, upon returning, he would risk turning the understanding he had gained during his journey into a new kind of rigidity, ringing the bell, no longer out of unthinking habit, but now with an intention so laden with meaning that it would lose the simple naturalness that Genmyo had described on his scroll. "I fear that upon my return, I might try to force too much intention into each ringing of the bell, seeking to artificially recreate the understanding I gained during this journey," Eisen confessed. Sigurd smiled, his expression suggesting he recognized that concern from his own experience. "It is a real risk, monk, but I will tell you the same thing I learned from my tapestries. The solution isn't to stop trying to be present, but to let go of the expectation that presence must look or feel a specific way every time. Some mornings you'll ring the bell with beautiful clarity and presence. Other mornings your mind will be occupied with everyday worries, and the ringing will be more mechanical, less conscious. Both experiences are a natural part of the practice. The mistake would be in harshly judging those less conscious mornings, instead of simply noticing them and continuing, without drama, with the next day's practice." That evening, Eisen helped Sigurd prepare dinner, chopping vegetables while she finished a section of the bird tapestry she was weaving. They shared a simple meal, chatting about lighter topics: the customs of the village, the seasons, the changes in the weather that Sigurd had observed over his many years working outdoors under the shed. Before going to sleep, Sigurd showed Eisen a small square of cloth, barely the size of a handkerchief, woven with threads of various colors in a simple but harmonious pattern. "I knitted this while you were traveling, thinking about your story," Sigurd said, handing her the small piece of fabric. "It doesn't represent anything in particular. It's just an exercise in presence, knitted without any predetermined design, letting my hands follow their own impulse moment by moment. Take it with you, monk, as a reminder that not everything we create needs to have a clear meaning or a defined purpose. Sometimes, the simple act of creating mindfully is enough in itself." Eisen thanked him for the gift, placing it next to Baisen's basket and Tairio's bell, and the next morning, after bidding Sigurd farewell with a deep bow, he continued on his way to the river, where Eisen, the fisherman, was surely still mending his nets with deliberately large holes, the net that no longer needed mending. The river appeared before Eisen exactly as he remembered it. Slow, greenish waters, tall reeds swaying gently in the breeze, and the small wooden boat moored near the bank. Eisen wasn't mending his net this time, but sitting quietly by the water, watching the steady flow of the stream with a serene expression. "I didn't expect to see you so soon, monk," Eisen said, noticing Eisen's arrival. "Come, sit down. Tell me what you found at the end of your journey." Eisen sat on the same rock as on his first visit and recounted once again, His entire experience, the lake, the sunken temple, the story of Genmyo, the scroll, the silence that had replaced the distant sound, and the renewed conversations with Baishen, Tairyu, and Shigure on the way back. Aizen listened with the same patient attention he had shown during the first visit, without interrupting, nodding occasionally as the sound of flowing water provided a constant accompaniment to the monk's words. I remember asking you, the first time we spoke, whether you were searching for that bell because your life truly needed it, or because you had woven a web with holes that were too small, Aizen said, when Aizen finished his story. Have you found an answer to that question? Aizen pondered before replying, feeling that the question deserved careful consideration now that he had come this far. I think both things were true, in a way, she finally replied. My life did need something, though it wasn't exactly the physical bell I had initially imagined. I needed to understand why I rang my own bell every morning beyond mere habit. But it is also true that during the first months of hearing that distant sound, I wove a net with tiny holes, convinced that without finding the exact source of that sound, I could never feel truly pleased by the monk's reflection. It is wise to recognize both truths at once, monk. Life rarely offers simple answers from only one side. Let me tell you something that happened here, on this very river, while you were traveling. Aishin, curious, waited for Aishin to continue. A few weeks ago, a young fisherman from a nearby village came here, complaining that his nets never caught enough fish, no matter how much effort he put into improving them, Aishin recounted. I showed him my own net, with its deliberately large holes, and explained the lesson I had learned so many years ago, the same one I told you during your first visit. The young man, however, failed to grasp the meaning of my advice. He thought I had simply lost my ambition, and he left frustrated, convinced that he needed an even more perfect network than the one he already had. Do you think he'll ever learn his lesson? Aishin asked. Perhaps not, Aishin replied, shrugging with a calmness that betrayed no real concern about the outcome. Each person needs to arrive at their own understanding through their own path, just as you arrived at yours through this long journey you have just completed. I cannot force that understanding on anyone else, just as no one could force it on me when I was young and ambitious. I could only share my story, as I did with you, and trust that each person will receive it in the way their own stage of life allows them to. Aishin thought of the similar words Taiju had shared about his frustrated apprentice, and felt that this pattern was consistently repeated among all the people he had met on his journey. Genuine understanding could not be fully conveyed through words. It required each person to discover it through their own lived experience. Before you continue on your way to the temple, monk, let me ask you something, Aishin said, slightly shifting the tone of the conversation. What will you do if, upon your return, you find that some of the other monks don't understand why you were gone for so many days? Or if they question the value of your journey, why not return with a physical bell that you can show them as proof of your quest? Aishin hadn't considered that possibility clearly until that moment, and he felt a brief flicker of unease at the question. I don't know for sure, he answered honestly. Perhaps some monks won't fully understand what I learned during this journey, but I think that's okay. Just as you accept that the young fisherman may never understand the lesson of your net with large holes. Not all understandings need external validation to have real value. Aishin smiled broadly, displaying an expression of genuine approval. That is a wise answer, monk. And I'm glad to see how much you've grown since our first conversation by this river. They remained silent for a while, watching as the sun began its descent in the west, once again tinting the greenish waters with shades of orange and gold. just as it had during Aishin's first visit. But this time, the shared silence felt different, not tinged with the restlessness and urgent searching that had characterized their first encounter. Instead, there was a mutual, almost celebratory calm between two people who had shared something genuine through their respective stories. "Before you go, I want to give you something," Aishin said, getting up and walking toward his small boat. He returned with a small piece of the net he had been mending during Aishin's first visit, carefully cut into a small square, with several of the large holes still visible in its weave. "Take this with you, monk, along with the other gifts you surely received during your journey," Aishin said, handing him the small piece of netting. "And each time you look at it, remember the difference between a genuine need and a net woven with holes that are too small. That distinction, once you learn to recognize it clearly, will serve you for the rest of your life, long after this specific quest you have now completed." Aishin accepted the gift with a deep bow, placing it alongside Baishin's basket, Taryu's bell, and Shigra's small cloth. Before setting off for the stone ford across the river, he paused one last time and asked, "Will I ever see you again, Aishin?" The fisherman smiled, gazing at the horizon, where the mountains stood out against the warm-hued sky. "This river will always be here, monk, though it is never exactly the same river twice, just as Kanzen surely taught you with its lake. If your path brings you back here someday, you will find me, perhaps mending a new net, perhaps simply watching the water flow. Either way, it will be a joy to welcome you back." With those parting words, Aishin crossed the stone ford for the last time, feeling the cold water against the hem of his robes, just as he had felt it on his first crossing months before. Though inside everything felt profoundly different. The path back home. After crossing the river, Aishin walked for several days along the same path that had led him, months before, from the silent mountain temple to the valley where he had met Aishin. But the landscape, though physically identical, felt transformed under his new gaze. The barley fields he had crossed with haste and anxiety during his departure now seemed to invite him to walk more slowly, to notice the movement of the golden stalk swaying in the wind, the occasional flight of a bird crossing the clear sky, the scent of damp earth after a brief rain shower that surprised him on the third afternoon of his return. During the nights, while camping under solitary trees or in small natural caves he found along the way, Aishin mentally reviewed everything he had experienced. Aishin's lessons on the net with large holes, Shigra's teachings on the twisted thread woven with honesty, Taryu's wisdom on the difference between perfection and utility, the confidence Baishin had cultivated in his hands more than his eyes, Kanzan's acceptance of a constantly changing lake, and finally, the ultimate understanding he had attained among the dark fragments of Genmyo's shattered bell. Each of these lessons, Aishin noticed as he walked, did not exist in isolation, but rather intertwined with the others in a way that began to resemble, in his own mind, the tapestry Shigra wove on his loom. Distinct threads of different colors and textures, together forming a larger and more coherent pattern than any single thread could have created on its own. On the fifth night of his journey home, Aishin finally reached the base of the mountain where Silent Mountain Temple stood, and from there he could make out, high above, the familiar silhouette of the tower where he had rung its bell for 20 years. He felt a complex emotion upon seeing that silhouette against the starry sky, joy at being close to home, but also a kind of apprehension, similar to the one he had shared with Aishin during their last conversation about how he would be received by the other monks after such a long absence. He decided not to climb the mountain that very night, but to wait until the following dawn, allowing himself one last night of reflection before returning to his former life. He camped beside a small spring he knew well, a place where he used to stop for a drink during his youthful walks around the temple grounds. And as the fire he had lit crackled gently, he took out the gifts he had received on his journey: Bison's wicker basket, Tairyu's iron bell, Sigra's small woven cloth, and Aishin's piece of netting with large holes. He studied each object in the flickering firelight, recalling the story and lesson associated with each, and felt that these objects, humble and simple in appearance, carried a far greater meaning than any ancient and mysterious bell he could have found at the end of his original quest. They weren't trophies of conquest, but tangible reminders of genuine conversations, of moments of shared presence with people who, like him, were searching for meaning in their own everyday lives. At dawn, after a night of light but restorative sleep, Aishin began the final ascent to Silent Mount Temple, following the same rocky path he had walked countless times during his 20 years of monastic life, but which now, after months of wandering through unfamiliar lands, felt both familiar and renewed. As he climbed, he began to recognize specific points along the path he had forgotten during his journey. A peculiarly shaped rock that had always reminded him, as a child, of the head of a sleeping dragon. A particularly twisted pine tree that marked the exact halfway point to the summit. A small clearing where he used to stop to rest during the harshest winters, when the snow made every step difficult. Each of these familiar landmarks brought him a warm sense of recognition, as if his own body remembered the way even before his mind could consciously process it. He finally reached the temple's wooden gate around noon, and as he passed through it, he encountered the youngest monk, Andrin, sweeping the stone courtyard beneath the ginkgo tree. Upon seeing him, Andrin dropped his broom and hurried over with an expression of genuine relief and joy. "Brother Aisin," exclaimed Andrin, "we thought you might not return. It's been months since you left." Aisin smiled, feeling the warmth of the welcome, and briefly embraced the young monk, an unusual gesture between them, but one that felt completely natural at that moment. "I've returned, Brother Andrin, though perhaps not with what I expected to find when I left," Aisin replied. "Is Zuigan at the temple?" "He's in the main hall, meditating, as he does every midday," Andrin answered. "He will be very pleased to see you." Aisin walked toward the main hall, each footstep feeling familiar on the courtyard stones he had swept countless times during his monastic life. Upon entering, he found Zuigan seated in his usual meditation posture and waited patiently, without interrupting, until the lead monk opened his eyes and noticed his presence. "Aisin," Zuigan said, with a serene expression that showed no surprise, as if he had been expecting this return at that very moment. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Zuigan," Aisin replied, bowing deeply. "I've come back with many stories to tell, though I haven't brought the bell I set out to find." Zuigan smiled, his expression suggesting a deeper understanding than his words directly conveyed. "I remember telling you, before you left, that if you didn't find what you were looking for, perhaps you would find something else, and that something else might be precisely what you needed," Zuigan said. "Was it like that, Aisin?" "Yes, Zuigan, it was exactly like that," Aisin replied, feeling that the guiding monk's words captured, simply and precisely, all the complexity of his journey. "Then sit with me, brother, and tell me everything you experienced," Zuigan said, indicating a space beside him on the floor of the hall. "We have time. The bell doesn't need to be rung until tomorrow morning, and I think the other monks will also want to hear your story tonight at dinner." That afternoon and evening, Aisin recounted his entire journey to Zuigan, Anrin, and the other monks of the temple, who gathered around the central fire to hear every detail. He told of the fisherman by the river, the weaver in her village, the blacksmith in the forest, the blind old man among the ruins, the ferryman on the lake, the guardian of the sunken temple, and his story about Genmyo, and finally the return journey with his repeated visits to each of the people he had met along the way. The monks listened with rapt attention, some nodding in recognition of lessons that resonated with their own spiritual practice, others asking questions that helped Aisin articulate more clearly aspects of his journey that he had not yet fully processed in his own mind. When the story finally came to an end, late into the night, Zuigan remained silent for a long moment, watching the fire burning in the center of the room, before speaking. "Tomorrow morning, Aisin, you will again climb the 108 steps to the tower, and you will ring the bell when the light touches the distant mountain, just as you did for 20 years before your journey," Zuigan said. "But I believe all of us here tonight understand that ringing of the bell, though it will produce exactly the same physical sound it has produced for 2 decades, will now carry a renewed meaning, forged through this long journey you have just completed." Aisin felt those words perfectly captured the culmination of everything she had experienced, and for the first time since beginning her journey months earlier, she felt complete peace, without any lingering unease, at the prospect of returning to her daily duties at the temple. The 108 steps. Aisin slept that night in her old room, a small wooden room with a thin futon and a narrow window overlooking the stone courtyard and the ginkgo tree. Although the weariness of the journey and the long conversation with the other monks weighed heavily on his body, his mind remained awake for a long time, reviewing once more all that he had experienced, feeling each lesson gradually settle into a deeper place within his understanding, beyond the words with which he had shared it that very night. He awoke before dawn, following the same inner rhythm that had governed his body for 20 years of monastic life, a rhythm that not even months of travel through unfamiliar lands had managed to completely disrupt. He rose silently, so as not to wake the other monks who were still asleep, and went out into the courtyard, where the fresh early morning air greeted him with a clarity that felt like a silent welcome. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, with the first greyish hues that precede dawn, and the stars, still visible in the western sky, shone with an intensity Aisin had forgotten during his months of travel through valleys and forests, where the view of the night sky was frequently obscured by trees or low clouds. Here, on the mountaintop, the sky stretched out full and clear, a silent reminder of the vastness of the world he had traversed and to which he was now returning. He walked to the base of the tower, where the 108 stone steps ascended to the bell he had rung for 20 years, and began to climb, counting the steps without meaning to, just as he had done countless times before his journey. But this time, she noticed something different in the way her body experienced each step. Instead of a mechanical, automatic repetition, each step seemed to carry a weight of renewed attention, as if her whole body had learned, during the months of walking, to be present in a way it had previously only experienced partially and unconsciously. Reaching the top of the tower, where the great bronze bell hung exactly as she had left it months before, Aisin stopped and gazed at the horizon, waiting for the first light of dawn to touch the distant mountain, the signal that had marked the precise moment of her daily task for 2 decades. As he waited, he thought of Genmyo, the master craftsman who had cast the original bell, the one that now lay in dark fragments at the foot of a ruined tower across the lake. He thought of the words on the scroll, the old guardian had shown him, that the true purpose of a bell was not to produce a sound that traveled the farthest possible, but to create a moment of shared pause between the one who rang the bell and the one who heard its sound, no matter the distance between them. He also thought of Ryokan, the master who had established that instruction. So simple, yet so profound. Ring the bell when the light touches the mountain, and one day you will understand why. For 20 years, Aishin had followed that instruction without fully grasping its meaning, blindly trusting in the wisdom of his deceased master. And now, after a journey that had taken him through rivers, villages, forests, ruins, and lakes, he was finally beginning to understand that the true teaching had never been in the destination of his quest, but in the very process of seeking with mindfulness, from truly listening to every person who crossed her path, from allowing each story to weave something new into her own understanding of the world. The first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon. First, like a thin, golden line separating the dark sky from the silhouette of the distant mountains, and then, gradually, like a growing glow that began to tinge the scattered clouds floating above the valley with pink and orange. Aisin watched as that light slowly advanced toward the summit of the farthest mountain, the exact spot that had marked the time of his daily task for 20 years, and felt his heart beat with a profound calm, without any of the anxiety or urgency he had sometimes felt during his early years as bellkeeper, when he still doubted his own ability to perform the task properly. When the light finally touched the distant mountaintop, bathing it in a golden glow that contrasted brilliantly against the still dark sky, Aisin reached for the thick rope hanging beside the bell, feeling the familiar texture of the braided fiber beneath his fingers, the same rope he had wrung countless times over 2 decades. Before pulling, he paused, taking a deep breath, allowing his full attention to focus on the present moment. The cool morning air on his face, the weight of the rope in his hand, the absolute silence preceding the sound he was about to produce. A silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the pines on the mountainside. And then, with a firm yet gentle motion, he pulled the rope. The sound of the bell spread across the valley exactly as it had every morning for 20 years, a deep, resonant peal that seemed, for an instant, to stop time itself, suspending the entire world in a vibration shared between the bronze, the air, the mountain, and the heart of the one who heard it. But this time, Aishin didn't just hear the sound with his ears. He felt as if he heard it with his whole being. With all the understanding accumulated during months of travel, with the full presence that Genmyo had described in his scroll as the true purpose of any bell, large or small, old or new, the sound gradually faded, spreading across the valley, perhaps echoing between distant mountains in the same way that Genmyo's original bell had traveled generations ago, to remote temples that adjusted their schedules according to that distant call. And finally, the sound dissolved completely into the air, leaving behind a silence even deeper than the one that had existed before the ringing, just as Aishin had experienced countless times during his 20 years of practice. But in that subsequent silence, Aishin felt something he had never felt so clearly during his previous years of mechanical practice. A complete understanding, not as a verbal response he could easily articulate, but as a deep, silent, bodily certainty that this simple act of ringing the bell, repeated each morning with full presence, contained within itself all the meaning he had sought during his long journey through unfamiliar lands. He remained atop the tower for a long time after the sound had completely dissolved, watching as the dawn light continued to spread over the valley, gradually illuminating the fields, the distant forests, and the river that he knew flowed, somewhere far away in that landscape, toward the place where Aishin was surely already awake, mending his net with deliberately large holes, or perhaps simply watching the water flow with the same serene patience that Aishin was now beginning to understand in a completely new way. The seasons that followed, the days after Aishin's return, unfolded with the same tranquil structure that had characterized his monastic life for 20 years. Sweeping the courtyard before dawn, preparing tea, the hours of meditation in the main hall, tending the back garden where turnips and eggplants grew, but within that familiar structure, Aishin noticed subtle changes in his own way of inhabiting each daily activity, changes that didn't alter the outward form of his tasks, but profoundly transformed the quality of his presence in each of them. When she swept the courtyard, she noticed more clearly the distinct sound of dry leaves sliding across the stone, a sound that had previously gone unnoticed amidst the automaticity of repeated habit. When she prepared tea, she felt more attentively the warmth of the water against her hands, the distinct aroma of the leaves as they unfurled in the hot liquid, moments that had previously blended indistinctly into the general routine of the day. And each morning, when she climbed the 108 steps to the tower to ring the bell, she experienced each step with renewed presence, without that renewed focus ever becoming the forced rigidity that Shiga had warned her about during her second visit. As the weeks passed, Aishin also began to share gradually and unhurriedly some of the stories he had gathered during his journey with the young monk Anrin, who showed a genuine interest in understanding not only the external events of the path, but also the deeper lessons each encounter had imparted to Aishin's understanding. He didn't give him all the stories at once, remembering Aishin's words about the impossibility of forcing understanding on another person, but shared them little by little, in moments that seemed to arise naturally during their shared daily work, while they tended the garden together, while they swept the courtyard, while they waited silently for dawn before Aishin went up to ring the bell. One afternoon, toward the end of summer, Anrin asked Aishin if one day he too would have to undertake a similar journey to fully understand the meaning of his own monastic practice. "I don't know, Brother Anrin," Aishin replied, sitting beside the young monk at the edge of the vegetable garden, watching the afternoon sun illuminate the green leaves of the turnips they had planted together months before. "My journey began because I heard a sound that no other nun in the temple could perceive, a sound that propelled me on a quest that even I didn't fully understand at first. I don't know if you will hear a similar sound in your own life, nor do I know if that sound, if it comes, will lead you down an external path like mine, or a different one, perhaps one that doesn't require physically leaving this temple." "And what if I never hear any special sounds?" Anrin asked, his expression a mixture of genuine curiosity and a hint of concern. "Does that mean I'll never attain the understanding you did?" Aishin smiled, recalling Bison's words about understanding as a path traveled repeatedly, rather than a destination reached only once. "I don't think so, Brother Anrin. I believe each person finds their own path to understanding, and that path doesn't need to resemble mine to be equally valid. Perhaps your understanding will come through years of silent practice right here in this temple, without the need for any external journey. Perhaps it will come through an unexpected conversation with a traveler who crosses our gate someday. Or perhaps, as it happened to me, it will come through a distant sound that only you can hear. What matters, I believe, is not the specific form the path takes, but the willingness to pay genuine attention to it when it presents itself, no matter how unexpected or uncomfortable that attention may seem at first. Autumn arrived on the mountain with its usual display of color in the leaves of the few deciduous trees growing among the pines, and the ginkgo tree in the central courtyard turned a brilliant yellow that, according to temple tradition, marked the time for a simple celebration among the monks. A special meal was prepared with produce from the garden, and a few ingredients reserved especially for that annual occasion. During that celebration, Zügen asked Isin to share her full story again with the entire temple community, now that she had had several months to integrate the experience into her daily life. Isin agreed, and that night, around the central fire, she recounted her journey once more. But she noticed that the narrative itself had subtly changed since the first time she had shared it, months earlier. On the night of her return, certain details that she had previously emphasized with urgency were now told with greater calm. Certain lessons he had previously articulated tentatively now flowed with a more settled clarity, the product of additional months of reflection and integrated practice. As he finished his account, one of the temple's oldest monks, who rarely spoke during community gatherings, asked a question that surprised everyone present. "Isin," he said, "do you think that if Ryokan, our deceased teacher, could have heard your entire story, he would have been surprised by the path your understanding had taken? Or do you think he somehow already knew where that simple instruction he left you before he died would eventually lead you?" Isin pondered deeply before answering, sensing the weight of the question as something that deserved careful consideration. "I can't know for sure, brother," he finally replied, "but I believe Ryokan understood something that took me 20 years and a long journey to grasp. That certain teachings cannot be fully conveyed through pre-explained words, but need to be lived, experienced, discovered through each person's own path. Perhaps Ryokan didn't know exactly what form my path to understanding would take, but he trusted that if I maintained the discipline of ringing the bell each morning with as much presence as possible, that path would eventually reveal itself, in whatever way it needed to reveal itself specifically to me." Winter arrived on the mountain with its customary blanket of snow and bitter cold, and Isin continued to climb the 108 steps each morning, even during the most severe storms, when frost coated the bell rope and her hands grew numb before she could complete the first ring, just as it had during so many winters before her journey. But now, each of those winter rings, performed with physical difficulty but with renewed mental clarity, felt like a natural continuation of all she had learned on her journey through valleys, rivers, forests, and ruins. The understanding that full presence depended not on favorable external conditions, but on an inner discipline cultivated moment by moment, step by step, ring by ring. The instruction passed down. Several years passed after Isin's return, years marked by the steady rhythm of the seasons that followed one another on the mountain. Springs of slow mule driving, summers of hard work in the garden, golden autumns under the ginkgo tree, and winters of deep snow that isolated the temple from the rest of the valley for weeks. Throughout all that time, Isin continued to climb the 108 steps every morning, ringing the bell when the light touched the distant mountain, fulfilling the instruction Ryokan had left him decades before, now with an understanding that felt as natural and settled as his own breath. The young monk Andrin, meanwhile, had grown up under the daily guidance of Isin and the other monks of the temple, gradually maturing from a restless and curious apprentice into a man of deeper understanding, though still developing as befits any genuine spiritual path. Over the years, Andrin had assumed increasing responsibilities within the daily life of the temple, and Züigen, who had aged considerably during that time, began to delegate more and more important decisions to Isin. recognizing in him a spiritual maturity that surpassed even that of his pre-journey years. One spring morning, when Aisin was already beginning to feel the weight of age on his knees as he climbed the 108 steps, a weight that inevitably reminded him of Ryokan during his final years, Aisin called to Andrin, now a grown man of solid understanding, and asked him to accompany him to the bell tower before dawn. They climbed the steps together in silence, with Aisin occasionally pointing out small details of the path that Andrin might not have noticed before, despite having climbed those same steps countless times during his years of apprenticeship. A specific crack in the stone of step 43, which had to be avoided during freezing winters. A spot on step 78, where the wind blew particularly hard, requiring a firmer footing to maintain balance. Upon reaching the summit, with the sky still dark but beginning to show the first greyish signs of dawn, Aisin paused beside the large bronze bell and turned to Andrin. Andrin, Brother Andrin, the time has come for you to take on the responsibility of ringing this bell each morning, Aisin said, his voice calm but laden with a meaning they both deeply understood. My knees no longer allow me to climb these steps as easily as before, and I feel it is time for this task to pass into younger hands. Andrin, though he had anticipated that this moment would eventually arrive, felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders with an intensity he hadn't quite expected. What should I know, Brother Aisin, before I undertake this task? Andrin asked, perhaps hoping for a detailed explanation of the profound significance of ringing the bell, similar to the lessons Aisin had gradually shared with him over the years. But instead, Aisin smiled an expression that Andrin recognized after a moment as very similar to the way Zuygen used to smile during moments of profound shared wisdom. Ring the bell when the light touches the mountain, and one day you will understand why, Aisin said, repeating the exact same words Ryokan had left him decades before he died. Andrin, surprised by the simplicity of this instruction, after years of deep and detailed conversations with Aisin about the lessons of his journey, initially felt a pang of disappointment, perhaps similar to the uncertainty Aisin himself had felt in his youth upon receiving the same instruction from Ryokan. Is that all? Andrin asked, unable to suppress a hint of surprise in his voice. After all the stories you told me about your journey, about Aisin, Shigure, Tairyu, Bison, Kanzan, and the Guardian of the Ruins, does it all boil down to this simple instruction that I've known for years? Aisin observed Andrin with an expression of profound understanding, recognizing in that question the same question he himself had carried for 20 years of practice before embarking on his own journey. The stories I shared with you, Brother Andrin, were not the instruction itself, but the path that led me to fully understand it, Aisin replied. I shared them with you, not so that you would memorize their lessons as if they were fixed formulas, but so that you would know that a path of understanding is available should you ever feel the need to walk it yourself. Ammetit. But the essential instruction, the one that truly matters each morning when you climb these steps, will always be as simple as the one Ryokan left me and the one I now leave you. Ring the bell when the light touches the mountain, and one day you will understand why. Andrin remained silent, watching the sky begin to clear in the east, gradually understanding that the simplicity of that instruction did not represent a lack of depth, but rather an open door to a depth that each person must discover through their own path, just as Aisin had done, and just as Ryokan had done before him, in a chain of transmission stretching back through generations of monks who would likely never know the specific details, but who shared the same fundamental essence. I understand, Brother Aisin, Andrin finally said, his voice reflecting genuine acceptance rather than mere resignation. I will ring the bell each morning when the light touches the mountain, and I will trust that understanding will come in due time, in the way it needs to come specifically for me. Asin smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that Andrin had grasped, with a swiftness that had taken him much longer, the essential nature of the instruction he had just received. Now ring the bell this morning, Brother Andrin, while I watch, Asin said, taking a step back to make room beside the thick rope that hung next to the large bronze bell. Andrin approached the rope, feeling its familiar texture beneath his fingers, a texture he had touched occasionally during his apprenticeship, but never with the full responsibility he now felt on his shoulders. He waited, watching the horizon, until the first light of dawn finally touched the distant mountaintop, exactly as Asin had taught him to recognize over the years, and then, with a firm but gentle motion, he pulled the rope. The sound of the bell echoed across the valley, exactly as it had for decades under Asin's care, and now, for the first time, under Andrin's. Asin watched the young monk as the sound gradually faded into the morning air, and noticed in his expression a mixture of solemnity and awe that he intimately recognized, a reflection of his own experience during his early years as keeper of the bell, decades ago, when the task still felt new and burdened with a weight he was only beginning to grasp. "How did it feel?" Asin asked, though he already suspected, from Andrin's expression, what the answer would be. "It felt whole," Andrin replied, searching for the right words to describe a sensation he still couldn't quite articulate, as if something had both closed and opened at the same time. Asin nodded, feeling that this simple yet accurate description captured something essential to the experience he himself had lived countless times throughout his years of practice, and which Andrin was now beginning to experience for the first time, at the start of his own path toward an understanding that his horn and repeated practice could fully deepen. The circle closes. Over the years, Asin gradually became the guiding monk of Silent Mount Temple, assuming the role Zuigan had held for so long. After the latter, now very old, decided to retire to a life of silent meditation in a small cabin built especially for him in a quiet corner of the forest near the temple. Asin visited Zuigan regularly, bringing him tea and sharing leisurely conversations about temple life, about the new monks who occasionally sought spiritual refuge, about the seasons that continued to unfold with their inevitable rhythm on the mountain. Andrin, meanwhile, had fully assumed the responsibility of ringing the bell each morning, climbing the 108 steps with the same dedication that Asin had shown throughout his own decades of service. And although Andrin never undertook a physical journey similar to Asin's, over the years he began to develop his own profound understanding of the simple instruction he had received, an understanding that, while different in its specific form from the one Asin had attained, shared the same fundamental essence, full presence, as the true heart of any spiritual practice, beyond the external form that practice might take. One autumn afternoon, many years after his original journey, Asin walked alone through the temple's stone courtyard, watching the leaves of the ginkgo tree, now as familiar as his own breath, slowly fall and gather in small golden mounds on the grey stones. He stopped beneath the tree, feeling the weight of years in his joints, and allowed his mind to wander freely to the memories of that journey which had so profoundly shaped the course of the rest of his life. He thought of Isin, the fisherman, and wondered if he still lived beside that slow-moving greenish river, mending his net with deliberately large holes, perhaps teaching new young fishermen the same lesson it had taken him so long to learn for himself. He thought of Sigur, the weaver, and wondered how many more tapestries she had completed since then. How many twisted threads she had honestly woven into her designs, instead of violently concealing them. She thought of Tairyu, the blacksmith, and wondered if any other apprentice had reached his solitary forge, someone patient enough to understand the difference between perfection and utility. Without needing to abandon his apprenticeship prematurely, she thought of Bison, the blind old man, and felt a pang of sadness considering that, given his advanced age at their first meeting, he had probably already passed away, though his wisdom about trusting the hands rather than the eyes remained vivid in Isin's memory, as if she had heard it only yesterday. And she thought of Kanzan, the ferryman, still crossing that ever-changing lake, guiding new travelers across its unpredictable waters, perhaps sharing with them the story of his father, just as he had shared it with Isin during that return journey. He hadn't visited any of them since that original trip, though during the first few years after his return, he had repeatedly considered undertaking a similar journey, this time without the urgency of a specific quest, simply to reconnect with those who had so profoundly shaped his understanding of life. But the increasing responsibilities of the temple, and perhaps also a deeper realization that certain experiences didn't need to be physically repeated to remain alive in the heart, had kept him in silent solitude, fulfilling his role as spiritual guide to a new generation of monks. That very afternoon, as Isin continued his contemplative walk beneath the ginkgo tree, Anrin approached, now also a middle-aged man, with lines of wisdom beginning to appear on his own face, similar to those Isin had borne for years. "Brother Isin," said Anrin, sitting down beside him on a stone bench placed beneath the tree branches. "A young man came to the temple today seeking refuge and instruction. He says that for the past few weeks he has heard a sound that no other member of his family can perceive. A sound that brought him to our doorstep, seeking to understand its meaning." Isin felt his heart give a strange flutter upon hearing those words, such a precise echo of his own experience decades ago, that for a moment he felt as if time itself had folded back on itself, uniting the past and the present in a single, shared instant. "What kind of sound?" Isin asked, though he already suspected, with a certainty he couldn't quite explain, what the answer would be. "He says it's the sound of a bell, Brother Isin," Anrin replied. "A bell that no one else in his village can hear, coming from somewhere far away in the mountains." Isin remained silent for a long moment, feeling the cool autumn breeze gently stir the last leaves of the ginkgo tree above their heads. And finally he smiled, a smile that carried both nostalgia and a deep joy at recognizing that the circle he had begun with his own journey decades ago continued to extend into new generations in ways he could never have fully predicted, but which felt somehow essential, like a natural continuation of all he had learned. "Bring him here, Brother Anrin," Isin said finally. "I want to hear his story, and perhaps, if he is willing to listen, share with him some of what I myself learned so many years ago, during a journey that began in a manner very similar to his." That night, as the young newcomer, whose name was Genjiro, shared his own story about the mysterious sound that had drawn him to Silent Mountain Temple, Isin listened with the same patient attention that Isin, Sigure, Tyryx, Bison, and Kanzan had shown him during his own journey decades before. And when it was his turn to respond, he didn't give Genjiro a complete and definitive explanation of the sound's meaning. Instead, following the same pattern of wisdom he had received from so many different people on his own path, he began to share fragments of his own story, allowing the young man to gradually find his own connections and understandings, rather than simply memorizing the conclusions Isin had reached on his own. As the following weeks passed, Genjiro remained at the temple, learning the basic routines of monastic life under the guidance of Andrin and the other monks, while Isin, in occasional conversations during shared work in the garden or during contemplative walks under the jingo tree, continued to share fragments of his own story, always with the same patience he had learned to value during his own journey. One morning, several months after Genjiro's arrival, Isin decided it was time to let him go, following his own path to the western mountains, just as he himself had done so many years before. Before his departure, he gave the young man a small gift, the wicker basket that Bison had given him during his own journey, now worn by the passage of time, but still functional and sturdy. "Take it with you, Genjiro," Isin said, handing him the basket with both hands, a gesture of transmission that felt laden with profound meaning. "A blind old man gave it to me many years ago, near some ancient ruins on the other side of a dense forest, telling me that the skill of weaving without constantly looking isn't learned in a single day, or even on a single journey, but by repeating the gesture again and again, trusting more and more in what the hands already know. I believe that lesson will serve you well too, in ways you may not yet fully understand, but which will reveal themselves in time, along your own path." Genjiro left that very morning, crossing through the wooden gate of Silent Mount Temple, exactly as Isin had done decades before, carrying with him not only the wicker basket, but also the fragmented stories he had gathered during his months at the temple. Stories that, Isin knew, would transform and deepen in unpredictable ways as the young man lived them through his own journey, his own encounters, his own gradual understandings. Isin watched from the stone courtyard as Genjiro's figure grew smaller and smaller on the path that descended into the valley, until finally he disappeared around a bend in the path, hidden by the pine trees that grew crooked in the constant mountain wind. And as he gazed at the spot where the young man had vanished, he felt a profound calm settle in his chest, a calm he recognized as the same he had felt years before, atop the bell tower, after hearing the bronze sound dissolve completely into the silence of dawn. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent in the west, painting the sky with the same golden and orange hues that had accompanied so many important moments of his own journey, Isin climbed with the slower but equally firm step that now characterized his aging body, the 108 steps to the bell tower. Although it was not yet dawn, the time when Henri usually failed to perform that task, he did not ring the bell that afternoon. He simply sat beside it, watching the valley spread out below, the distant fields where he had once crossed rivers and unknown paths, the mountains silhouetted against the horizon, hiding somewhere far away the ruins where Genmyo had cast generations ago, a bell whose physical sound no longer existed, but whose deepest teaching continued to resonate, generation after generation, through shared stories, silences held together, and young seekers arriving one after another, following sounds only they could hear, toward understandings that each had to discover, ultimately, for themselves. The wind blew softly through the pines on the hillside, stirring the last golden leaves of the yingo tree in the distant courtyard. And Isin, sitting by the silent bell, felt that his entire long journey, from that first autumn night when he had heard a distant sound no other monk could perceive, to this present moment of serene contemplation atop the very tower where it had all begun, had come full circle. Not because he had returned to the exact same spot where he had started, but because he had finally understood that the starting point and the destination, observed with sufficient presence and attention, had never truly been separate from one another. The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, and the shadows of the mountains gradually lengthened over the valley, while the silence of the mountain enveloped Aisin in a stillness that required no additional sound to feel complete, a silence that held within it all the sounds that had ever existed, and all the sounds that, in the future, some young seeker yet to arrive would hear for the first time, following a path he was only beginning to understand. The silence that remains night slowly descended upon the silent temple mountain, and Aisin, still seated by the bell at the top of the tower, watched as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, one by one, silent and distant, exactly as they had appeared for countless nights throughout his life. The wind had died down with the arrival of darkness, and now only a soft murmur moved among the pines on the hillside, a sound so faint it was barely distinguishable from the very silence that enveloped it. He thought, once again, of Genjiro, imagining him far from the temple, perhaps camped beneath some solitary tree in the middle of an open field, just as he himself had done during his own journey decades before. He silently wished that the young man would find on his path the same generosity that he had found in Aisin, in Shigure, in Teryu, in Bison, in Kanzan, and in the old guardian of the sunken ruins. He wished that each story shared with him would gradually weave his own understanding, perhaps different in its specific form from the one Aisin had attained, but equally genuine, equally profound. He finally descended the 108 steps when darkness had completely fallen, counting each one with the same familiar rhythm his body had memorized decades before, and crossed the stone walkway beneath the jingo tree, its bare branches now silhouetted against a sky studded with stars. In his small, simple room, he lay down on the thin futon, feeling the accumulated weariness of a long, contemplative day settle gently into his muscles, inviting him to a rest he felt was well-deserved and complete. Before closing his eyes, Aisin thought one last time about the simple instruction Ryokan had given him so many years ago, the same one he himself had passed on to Anrin, and which one day, perhaps, Anrin would pass on to another young monk, in a silent chain that would extend far beyond the lifetime of either of them individually. Ring the bell when the light touches the mountain, and one day you will understand why. Such a simple instruction, Aisin thought, as sleep gently began to envelop him, yet capable of containing within its simplicity an entire life's journey, with its rivers and forests, its losses and encounters, its unanswered questions, and its silent understandings finally attained, not through words, but through sustained presence, day after day, step by step, sound after sound. If ever, on some quiet night, you too happen to hear a distant sound that no one else around you seems to perceive, perhaps you don't need to undertake a journey as long as Aisin's to understand its meaning. Perhaps you only need to stop, breathe deeply, and allow that sound, whatever its origin, to gently guide you to rest with the same serene confidence with which the mountain greets each dawn, with the same patience with which the river receives each season, with the same stillness with which the silent mountain temple has received, generation after generation, each new seeker who crosses its gate, following the echo of a bell that perhaps never needed to be found, because its true sound was always there, silently, within those who knew how to listen, with a completely open and calm heart. Rest now, as Aisin rested that night beneath the starry sky of the mountain, knowing that tomorrow, when the light touches the distant peaks once more, the circle will continue turning gently, without haste, without effort, just as it has always turned. From times that no one can precisely recall, and which will continue to turn long after we have all ceased to hear any sound at all. In the western mountains, meanwhile, a young man named Genjiro walked beneath the same moon that illuminated the silent temple mountain, following a path that descended gently into a valley he had not yet explored. He did not yet know that 2 days later he would find a river of slow greenish water, where an old fisherman was mending a net with deliberately large holes. He didn't know that, a week later, he would meet a weaver capable of transforming a twisted thread into the most beautiful part of an entire tapestry. He knew nothing yet about solitary blacksmiths, blind old men who wove baskets without needing sight, ferrymen who crossed shifting lakes with quiet confidence, or about dark fragments of a bell destroyed centuries ago, patiently waiting among moss-covered ruins for someone to come willing to hear its full story. Genjiro only knew, as he walked beneath that starry sky, that a distant sound had called to him, and his heart, unable to fully explain why, trusted that following that calling, step by step, without haste, without absolute certainty about the final destination, was exactly what he needed to do at that moment in his life. And that simple trust, that willingness to walk toward the unknown, guided only by a sound that only he could hear, was enough, for now, to fill each step of his path with its own meaning, complete in itself, without yet needing any definitive answer about what he would find at the end. Thus, while Ajin slept soundly in his small room at the silent mountain temple, and while Genjiro walked under the same stars toward a still unknown future, the circle continued its silent and constant turning, uniting an old monk and a young seeker through the same mountain, the same sky, and the same sound of a bell that, rung with full presence, never truly ceases to resonate, even though its physical echo dissolves into the air long before its true meaning is fully revealed in the heart of the one who hears it.